Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our keynote address for this year's Public Affairs Conference. My name is Lauren Winnicky, and I am one of this year's Directors of Speakers. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Kimmie Weeks, is with us tonight via Skype. He came face-to-face with civil war in Liberia at the age of 9. Since then, he has committed his life's work to alleviating human suffering in Africa and around the world. He has led organizations that provide education, healthcare, and recreational supplies to thousands of children in West Africa, and has lobbied for the disarmament of over 20,000 child soldiers. In 1998, Dr. Weeks investigated and released a groundbreaking report on the Liberian government's involvement in the training of child soldiers. As a result, former Liberian President Charles Taylor made several attempts to assassinate Dr. Weeks until he was granted political asylum in the United States. During his stay in the US, Dr. Weeks established Youth Action International to support families in post-war countries. Its programs have benefited more than 200,000 people in 6 different African countries. In 2007, Dr. Weeks was decorated Knight Grand Commander in the Humane Order of African Redemption. He also received the Golden Brick Award, which honors global leaders under the age of 25. Dr. Weeks is also featured in the new book, Peace in Our Lifetime, as an international peacemaker, along with Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Weeks received his bachelor's from Amherst College, his master's from the University of Pennsylvania, and an honorary doctorate degree from Amherst College. Tonight, we have the privilege of listening to Dr. Weeks share his own grassroots reconciliation approach to preventing and managing conflicts throughout the world. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming this year's distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Kimmie Weeks.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all very much. It's great to be with you today. I do sincerely apologize that I couldn't join you. I had problems with my flight, but thankfully we have technology that allows me to see you and you can see me. I often say that, our world has definitely transformed tremendously. And so I'm thankful to the organizers who made this happen and who worked diligently to make sure that somehow I could be here. So as you know, I'm in Liberia right now. And as I always say, that sometimes the stars align for good things. I've tried many other times to make Skype conference calls or Skype video calls, and our internet is so slow in Liberia, it's worse than dial-up. So many times we can't even get through. Or sometimes you get through for a few seconds at a time, and it's absolutely amazing to have the situation where tonight I can have this, we can have this call and not be interrupted. So I thank you all for joining me. I come tonight to speak about the issue of peace and transformation. It's emotional for me as I deliver this speech. Because I'm sitting in Liberia, in a country that's my country, but a country where so much suffering and so much of the suffering I experience in my life happened right here. Usually when I deliver these speeches, I'm obviously in the US, in a completely different environment, surrounded by so much wealth and so much opportunity. It's, for me, a different feeling as I sit here in Liberia, knowing that I am right in the middle of the country that I nearly died in. Around the world, there are so many people who are experiencing wars, so many people who are experiencing extreme human suffering. There are historically throughout the world, we have seen a history of violence that has plagued our world, that has plagued our continents, and so many people have died from the human suffering that has happened. Even as I speak to you today, across Africa and across other parts of the world, so many young children are dying from hunger, are dying from diseases, and a majority of these deaths are happening in countries that have been affected by war and that have been affected by chaos and that have been affected by bloodshed. Whenever I see the images of children who are going through these circumstances, it reminds me of my own experiences. It reminds me of what we went through in Liberia. It reminds me of the pains of being hungry and not having access to food, the pains of being sick and not having access to medication. A lot of what I will talk to you about tonight will be extremely painful, will be extremely hard. But I want you to know there's another side of the message. The side that essentially there is a possibility of creating a new world. The possibility that a new world order is possible. And the final thing I want you to go away with is that the opportunity to change the world, the opportunity to create world change is not necessarily only about governments. It's not about the United Nations. It's about individuals. It's about how we, especially as young people, can come together and essentially change the world for the better. As you all know, Africa is a vast continent, and it has many countries, over 58 different countries. Each country varies from, place to place, from capital to capital. Not all of the countries are going through the same circumstances. Not all of the countries are going through the same pains. But we also know that a majority of the continent is experiencing some of the worst difficulties ever. A majority of the continent is experiencing war. A majority of the continent is experiencing famine, is experiencing bloodshed. We know that there are some countries, for example, like Liberia and Sierra Leone, who are struggling to come out of war. But those countries are still at a point where the circumstances are dire. In the case of Liberia right now, we're 6 years out of war. Liberia is fighting for development. Liberia is fighting to rebuild itself. Liberia is fighting to grow. But even with all of the strides that we have made, right now, as I speak to you, something as basic as water is a huge problem in Liberia, where many, many families are going through situations where they can't find clean drinking water or water at all and are lining up to wait for water. While countries like Liberia are struggling, there are also parts of Africa that have tremendous wealth, that has tremendous opportunities. Countries like Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Botswana, that have started to do much better. In each of these countries, there's obviously still poverty, but in many of them, we're starting to see development happen. on a very, very rapid scale. I believe on the screen right now, you should be seeing a map of Africa. It has not been distorted. This represents an actual map of Africa. And I now want you to look at this next photo, which shows, again, the map of the world, but uh, it has been transformed to show where the presence of the world's wealth is. As you can see in the case of Africa, it almost disappears. It becomes a thin line because the presence of the world's wealth is not in Africa. And this has caused a lot of suffering and a lot of pain across the continent. When I grew up in Liberia, this was a photo taken the year the Liberian Civil War started. I was 9 at that point. I lived in the capital with my mother. I can tell you that when we were growing up, or when I was growing up in Liberia, we never thought that there would come a point when we would come face to face with extreme human suffering. Liberia, just to give you a little background, had been founded by freed slaves who had left the United States after they had received their freedom and had gone back to Africa. The place that they settled was Liberia in 1822, and they named it Liberia for Liberty. From 1847, Liberia got its independence and was ruled as pretty much a one-party state until 1980. During this time was around the time that I came around, obviously very happy to see the world and experience what the world had to offer. And when I was born, Liberia at that point was believed to be one of the fastest growing African countries. People came from all over the world to Liberia for school, for education, for healthcare. In fact, during this time, Liberia boasts the largest regional airports that people had to come from East Africa, South Africa, around the world to fly out of Liberia if you needed to go anywhere else in the world. Now, I remember that when I was growing up, because we had access to so much, I never, and most Liberians for that matter, never imagined that there would be a point where we would be facing extreme human suffering or where we would be facing war and degradation. In fact, as I grew up, the closest we came to human suffering was watching on our television screen in the 80s as the Ethiopian famine was happening. And as a child, seeing the images of starving children, I always wondered to myself, and I would say to my mom, how is it possible that there's children somewhere in the world who don't have food to eat? And of course, my mom, used that as an excuse, and she would always say, well, that's even more reason for you to eat all your food. Of course, that was how she tried to get me on that one. But we never expected that war would hit Liberia. And I remember in 1989, a man named Charles Taylor had announced the start of the Liberian War as a grand revolution. Essentially, he had said that it would, at that point, Liberia was ruled by a dictator, Samuel Doe. And basically, Charles Taylor said to the Liberian people that when this war comes, it'll be a grand revolution. It will end in 3 days. There'll be no risk to life. There'll be no risk to infrastructure. Everything would be fine. I remember that when the war was first announced, in fact, people went out in the streets dancing, singing, and celebrating. I remember that it was just this joyful day. And, I was 9 at that point. I didn't understand politics,
But hey, I didn't have to go to school that day, so I myself went out dancing and singing in the streets. But obviously, when the war starts, it goes from where we realize that it will not be as simple as Charles Taylor had made it appear. In fact, I remember that my mother and I, who lived in the capital city, we started to watch on our television screens and we started to see the images of war approaching us, people being killed, houses being burned, children being lost from their families. And even though we lived in the capital, we knew with every passing day that this war was coming to us, that this degradation was coming to us as we watched the newscast. And so this fear was building in us every single day, not knowing what would happen. And after a few months, the war finally hit our homes. And I remember that for several days on end, my mom and I were in our home, hiding on the floor, having this intense fear that at any time a bullet could fly in through the window or a missile could fall in our house. In fact, I remember we could see the houses around our house as they were being burned down. And I had this shock in my mind, knowing that in those houses were friends who had played with, etc. After several days, when the rebels took over our home, they went from house to house, building to building, and they were forcing people to leave their homes essentially. And I remember that my mom and I left our home with only the clothing that we were wearing. And I remember getting on this highway, and as far as the eye could see, there were just thousands of people, thousands of Liberians who had been forced out of their house, many of them with small bundles, but most people with nothing in their hands, fleeing the fighting, trying to find a new place that we could call home. And as we were walking on this path, I remember for the very first time seeing the image of a child soldier, a child my age who was holding a real gun, who was committing atrocities. In fact, during the Liberian Civil War, children were the most feared of all the military forces. The youngest person, according to UNICEF, who was disarmed during the Liberian Civil War was 6 years old. So I just want you to think about that for a moment. A 6-year-old child being forced to fight and a 6-year-old child being forced to kill. But that was the reality for more than 20,000 Liberian children who were forced to join rebel armies across the country. Today I speak to you, hundreds of thousands of children are being used as child soldiers. In Uganda, there was one young woman who had been captured by the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, and she was held for several years. And when she was eventually rescued 4 years later by Amnesty International workers, she said to them, and I quote, "If only you could experience the suffering and pain for a single second, a sword of sorrow would pierce your heart," unquote. And I just want that to be in your mind for a moment. If only you could experience the suffering and the pain for a single second, a sword of sorrow would pierce your heart. But this woman had gone through this ordeal for 4 years as a child soldier in the Lord's Resistance Army, living under the worst conditions and being forced to commit the worst atrocities. There's also the issue of the hundreds of thousands, the millions of people, in fact, who have been forced from their homes, forced into displaced people centers. I remember at the end of that day walking, my mom and I, came to a university campus, which now was completely filled with people from the capital who had come in to find a place to call home, a safety net. And as we walked on this campus, all of the classrooms were already overcrowded. I mean, people were laying down on the sidewalks and on the street corners. And my mom and I walked from place to place, trying to find a room that we could get into. And eventually I remember that too, as we were walking past one of the buildings, someone essentially called to us and they said, if it's only the two of you, come in and we'll give you a place to stay. And I remember that we walked into this room, my mother and I. It was a small classroom, probably originally built for 30 students to sit in. And this classroom now had 16 families, and we're talking extended families, and everybody was just laying together, squished side by side. My mom had spread a cloth on the ground, and that was essentially supposed to become our home for the next 6 months. I remember that the first day that we got there, we knew we hadn't brought any food. The other thing that is important to know is at this point, the national water supply had been turned off. The national electric supply had been turned off. Doctors and nurses had left. Hospitals had been shut down. Every single thing you can think about that makes life normal had completely gone away. And the first night we got to that camp, I remember our parents were all saying to us, don't worry, we live in this caring world. We live in a world where the international community will not let us die from hunger. There will be food drops for Liberia. It will be a D-Day for Liberia. Peacekeepers would come in to rescue us. And this essentially was the hope that they were trying to give us, that we would get help from the outside world. And I remember that after a few days, that hope started to disappear, because even the people who brought food with them ran out of food. And that was when the real suffering and the real pain started for Liberian people. Because all of a sudden, parents, people who had worked their entire lives to feed their children, were now in a situation where their children were facing hunger and starvation, and there was absolutely nothing that they could do about it. I want you to imagine for a moment being a mother, and you find yourself in the situation, a mother or a father, and you find yourself in a situation where you are watching your children go without food from day in, day out. You're watching your children die from hunger and thirst, and there's simply nothing that you can do about it. But this is the reality for millions of people around the world. Millions of people, millions of mothers, millions of fathers who endure these circumstances because they simply have no other options, because they happen to be caught in a war situation, a war that they had no part to play in starting. And this was the situation for my mother, who every single day was there, was crying, was doing her very best to keep me alive. I remember that after a while, people started to get sick because even the water that we were drinking, the rebels had gone around to the nearby wells in the community, and they knew that we would be depending on this water, so they had killed people, threw bodies in the water. And even as we were drinking this water, you knew it was unclean, you knew it was unsafe, but we had no other option. And this essentially is what I refer to as extreme poverty. There's obviously poverty everywhere in the world, but the extreme poverty that affects so much of Africa is the poverty that kills. I remember becoming very sick. I caught several of the epidemics that were happening. Cholera, which is a disease that drains the body of fluids, malaria, and yellow fever, which essentially makes your eyes and your skin pale yellow. We weren't eating, and it was like people started to die in large numbers to the extent where they stopped burying people and doing burial rites and just simply going and throwing heaps, the bodies in heaps outside. And I remember I was just laying down on this floor, not walking, unable to walk, not even able to move, drifting in and out of consciousness. Each time I would wake up, I would see my mom's face, and she would always have this reassuring smile on her face. Most night we only drank water. She would make hot water, and that's what we would drink, just to feel like there was something in our stomach. There was a point that I had not gotten up for longer than usual. And people in the room started to get concerned. They kept coming to my mom and they kept saying, "What's wrong with Kimmie? What's happening with Kimmie?" And she kept saying, "Oh, no, he's fine. Nothing's wrong. Everything's okay." But there was a point where people stopped listening, and another person, because people in the room started to suspect that I had died, my mom was simply hiding it. So one of the people in the room who was not a medical doctor came up, and this person felt my pulse and immediately pronounced me dead. And my body was wrapped up in the cloth we were laying on and taken out to one of these heaps where I was thrown in a heap and discarded. And then they came back in and eventually let my mom go. When my mom ran out, she started going from heap to heap, pile to pile. It was like people thought that she had lost her mind, because they were, just imagine this woman walking through heaps of dead bodies until she finally found me. And all I remember from this is just feeling this violent shaking on my body. And I look up and I see my mom's face, and there's not the usual smile that's usually in her face or on her face, but there's just tears rolling down her eyes, and I can see that she's sad. I had no idea at that point that I was laying on a pile of dead bodies. My immediate reaction was, why is my mother crying, essentially? No idea where I was. It was that night that when my mom took me in and I had recovered a little bit, she told me the story of what had happened. And essentially, even as a child, I said, and even at that point believed, that nobody should have to live in the circumstances in war where they're surrounded by chaos, and where because of wars and because of violence and because of bloodshed, people are going through these deep, deep circumstances. It was also at that point when my mom told me that I decided to make a vow to spend the rest of my life working to ensure that no child went without food, no child went through the experiences that I went through. And essentially, over the years, I've had a vision of a new world, a world that I believe is absolutely possible, a world where there are no longer children dying from hunger or disease or because of bullets, a world where children are taken care of, where children are in peaceful environment, are in loving environment, a world where no longer there are child soldiers who are fighting and killing and being forced to be a part of war situation. And my work started very early on in Liberia. I remember that when I started, it was back in 1994. In fact, even before that, our first, very first program that we had done was a community cleanup campaign that we had started in our community coming back. And then after that, we decided that we wanted to do activism. So we started an organization called The Voice of the Future. And I remember it was a number of young children and we got together and we said we wanted to start this organization, and we were all excited about it, and we wanted to get out there, and we felt there was so much we could do. And the first thing we decided to do was to go to UNICEF. And we said, the UN had just come in town, and we said that we wanted them to support our programs. And the UN at that point was not used to giving money to a group of kids. And each time we would write them a letter, we would get a rejection. I guess they thought we were going to use the money to buy lollipops and candy, so they were not that was not flying. But I recall that it was over the course of 18 proposals that we sent to UNICEF. And the final proposal that we sent them, I guess the 18th proposal, they finally got tired hearing the name Kimmie Weeks, and so they said, give the dude some money, he'll go away and stop pestering us. And that's how we got our first funding for something called the Children's Disarmament Campaign. And with this Children's Disarmament Campaign, the whole concept of that was we as children felt that even if we could not end the entire Civil War, even if we could not stop the suffering and the pain, and we could not make the war in Liberia stop, what we wanted to do was to make sure that the children who were fighting, the children who were killing, the children who were committing atrocities, we said we as children want those children to lay down their guns. And our motto, our slogan was pens, not guns. Pencils, not guns. Now, we started going to the rural areas. Mind you, this was the first time, the very first time in history that groups of children were being vocal in Liberia. Usually the saying in Liberia was children should be seen but not heard. And in this campaign, where we wanted to get the guns away from the children who were fighting, we started to, we went out marching in the streets. We started to get on the radio, on the TV stations. We started going to the rural areas and talking to the rebel leaders themselves. Now, that was the scary part, because we were delegations of children who were leaving the comforts of our home in the capital city and going out into the rural areas, into the bushes, into the jungles to meet these rebel leaders, these men who were responsible for all of this killing and bloodshed. And I can tell you very many times it was very scary. But for us, that motivation to do it was there. That drive to do it was there because this was something we believed in. This was what we felt was our life. This was what we felt was our destiny. And sure enough, as we were meeting these rebel leaders and these rebel heads, as we were talking to them, each one of them, at the end of our petitioning process, each one of them started to sign petitions, essentially saying that the children should lay down their guns by the end of that year. I remember at the same time, a larger peace conference started. And they brought together the rebel leaders, and essentially they said back in '97 that the disarmament of children would start in December, and by the next year, June the next year, there would be full disarmament of all combatants. And sure enough, in the following months, thousands of young people, children, men, women, started to line up at various centers to turn in their guns, to lay down their guns. And peace returned to Liberia for the first time. You can imagine, for us, it was remarkable. For us, it was a moment in Liberian history. When that experience happened, the entire nation now had this feeling that finally, peace had returned to Liberia. Today, the work that we do extends beyond Liberia to places like Uganda, to Sierra Leone, that have experienced so much war and so much pain. Sometimes as I travel to post-war countries and even war-torn countries, as I meet people and talk to them and hear about their experiences, some of the stories that people tell and they retell, they are so hard that sometimes even I, as a war survivor, cannot begin to understand their pain, their suffering that they've gone through. And the most difficult part for people, and I often say that sometimes it's the easiest thing to get people to get into violence. It's the easiest thing to start a war. It's the easiest thing to start this chaos. It's so much harder to rehabilitate people once the damage has been done. And for many, many children in Liberia have been severely damaged by the war. In Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide that took place in 1994, over the course of a month, close to 1 million people, 800,000 people were hacked to death by their neighbors, by their workmates. Imagine that kind of trauma. In Sierra Leone, during the Sierra Leone Civil War, you had the situation where rebels would go from town to town, village to village, and they felt that their idea of stopping and ending democracy, because as you know, the base of democracy is the ability to vote, the ability to cast one's vote. And they felt that the way to stop people from casting their votes was simply to chop off their arms or chop off their legs so that they could not walk to the ballot box. So thousands of Sierra Leoneans, even young babies, some of them 6 months, 7 months, had their limbs hacked up by rebel forces who wanted to prevent them from voting. And so as these countries come back from war, the question is, how do you heal the pain? How do you bring nations back together that have been torn apart by years of war and fighting? And it's a key thing for Youth Action International, going into the communities and holding peace summits and dialogues and bringing people together, young people, the young generation, bringing them together. But a key part of our work as well is how do you provide the opportunities to empower people? If you think about it, as countries rise out of war, the challenges are many, very, very many. In fact, I often say in the Liberian situation, it was almost as if Liberia has gone to negative 50, and now we're just working our way back up to zero before we start progressing to 10, to 20, to 50, to get to 100. And one of the things that Youth Action International, my organization, is always trying to do is essentially how can we find innovative ways to empower young people. The photo you are looking at now is a photo of a diamond mine, or what used to be a diamond mine. As you can imagine, in the case of Sierra Leone and in fact Liberia, there's the saying that there is so much diamond in these countries that you can go out in your backyard and you can find a diamond. Well, here in Liberia, I'm still digging my backyard, haven't found one. I might go back out there again after I finish this talk and see if I find a diamond. But there is so much of these diamond mines in Sierra Leone that this one, for example, has been mined out. So there's just hundreds of acres like this across Sierra Leone that has simply been mined out, and they're left with these huge potholes. Nobody wants to do anything with them. And so we go to the community leaders, to the community elders, and we tell them, please give us this land. Nobody wants to use it. We want to use it. And sometimes they laugh at us. I know most of the time when we go for the negotiations, they probably think that I'm a crazy man wanting land that is considered worthless. But then we bring in child soldiers, former child soldiers, the same children, the same young people who are forced to work in the diamond fields. We work with them, we do training with them, we do counseling with them, we provide them in the agricultural skills. Then they go to work and reclaim this land and make it an agricultural plot. What you're looking at is the transformation that has happened, where these child soldiers are now able to grow crops, to feed themselves, to feed their families, etc. We're also working with women across the country, young women who were sexually exploited during the course of the war, young women who, because of the war, have no opportunities. You're looking at some of the products being made by young women in our centers, providing all other kinds of training, providing micro-lending so young people can start their businesses, etc. Our organization has a very, very small budget, but we have been able to have a huge impact on the lives of people. Sometimes as I look at the work, I say to myself, if we are able to make change using such a small amount of resources, what would it take if the world really puts its energy and efforts into ending extreme human suffering, into working to create a peaceful and just world? And sometimes when I make that statement, people say, oh, Kimmie, it's just a utopian dream. This can never, ever happen. And I say, no, it's possible that we can make change happen, because what it would take to change the world is really not much. You should be seeing on your screen right now some figures. These are from the Millennium Development Goals, which essentially is a blueprint put out by the United Nations that essentially tries to chart what we can do as the world's people to ensure that by 2015, we can eradicate some of the extreme human suffering and being on a path to creating a peaceful world. Today, the Millennium Development Goals are all off track. Most countries will not achieve the Millennium Development Goals because the world's body has refused to put the money necessary for these goals. Now, I want you to look at these figures, that they're all under the Millennium Development Goals. The provision of basic education for the world's children. There are 640 million children who want to go to school but cannot go to school, would cost the world $6 billion annually. Providing water and sanitation so people are not dying from cholera, $9 billion. Reproductive health for women, $12 billion. And the one that really hurts me, as someone who nearly died from hunger, the price tag for basic health and nutrition, so mothers are no longer watching their children die from starvation, runs at 13 billion. Now, I want you to remember these figures, 6 billion, 13 billion. And now I want you to look at this next slide. We're not putting our money into those basic services, but look at where we're spending our money instead. Perfumes in the US, $12 billion. Remember, education would be $6 billion, but we spend more on perfumes alone than what it would take to provide basic education for the world's people. Pet foods in the US, $17 billion. Now, I'm not saying don't feed your pets. Please go keep feeding them. But this should put it in perspective that we spend more on pet foods than what the UN estimated it would take to provide basic health and education and basic health and nutrition for the world's people. Business entertainment in Japan, 35 billion. Cigarettes in Europe alone, 50 billion. Alcoholic drinks in Europe, and mind you, this isn't the hard stuff, people. This is just beer. 105 billion. Narcotic drugs in the world, 400 billion. And the U.S. spending on Pentagon, this was pre-Iraq, $780 billion. The total cost of the Millennium Development Goal stood at $250 billion a year. I think this is a clear indication that if we really, really wanted to change the world, if we really, really wanted to have an impact on the world's people, it would be possible to do it. We have the resources. We live in a point in history where at no other point have we had the knowledge and the resources and the know-how to end extreme poverty. The irony of it is that on the flip side of that, we also live in a point in history where we are seeing the most human suffering, the most pains, the most amount of wars and killing and brutality against each other. There are times that I turn on my TV and I'm hoping that there would be someone somewhere talking about these issues, that the newspapers would be carrying a story that 30,000 children have died today from preventable causes. But one day I turn on CNN and CNN is talking about how Paris Hilton lost her chihuahua, and the next day I turn it on, they're talking about how she found the damn chihuahua. Now, in the general scheme of things, I don't think that's news. The news should be that there are people suffering and dying, that people are being killed, that people are undergoing the worst violence, but that we also have the possibility of creating a new world, that we also have the possibility of making change happen. I believe this possibility exists for all of Africa. And there is a chance, yes, as much as we see the human suffering, as much as we see the degradation, I believe there is hope for Africa. And I want to talk to you now about the people who I believe matter. People who I believe are the ones that are going to change the continent. The women across the villages and towns of Africa who, despite all they have seen, are working, fighting, trying to be a part of local politics, trying to start businesses, trying to do whatever it takes to feed their families. The young children who, despite what they've gone through, despite the pains and the suffering they see, still have that curiosity to learn, to laugh, to play, to want to be like kids everywhere. The young women who are used and abused, who, if they're given even the smallest opportunity to go to school, to learn a trade, are able to turn their lives around and feed not just their families, but they're able to take care of so many other people in their communities. The young men, the former child soldiers who are used and abused during these civil conflicts, but who still have dreams and visions of being doctors, of being engineers, of being nurses. And finally, I want to talk about you. The possibility that each person in that room and each person around the globe has a tremendous part to play in this idea of creating a new world. Once I was traveling and I saw someone who had a t-shirt, and I can never forget this t-shirt, because printed on it was the slogan, "Stop bitching, start a revolution." Stop bitching, start a revolution. Because, and why that resonates so much, is because there's so many times that we simply sit down and we talk and we talk and we talk. But when it comes to the action, when it comes to going out there and taking real action and making that impact and turning our actions or our words into action, so many times we never follow through. We all have to commit to creating this new world. And it begins with young people. I want to see, and I'm sure you all want to see, a world free of violence, a world free of poverty, extreme poverty, a world where there are no longer people who are watching their children die from hunger and pain. I'd like to see a world, and I want my children to grow up in a world where they're not experiencing what I've experienced, where they're not going through what I've gone through. It's a challenge for us all. I'm sure that there's probably many, many people in that room who have had an idea for creating something that would be bigger than themselves, for creating something that would transform the world in a positive way. But many times we have these ideas, and sometimes people are very easy to let it go. I tell you something, and I say it all the time. I'm not a particular genius. I mean, most of the ideas that I've had for programs that have benefited thousands of people came at the most random moment. I mean, sometimes I'm in the shower and I'm singing and I'm freaking myself out because you want to hear me speak, but you never ever want to hear me singing. It's just bad news. But sometimes I'm there, here I am, singing, freaking myself out, and all of a sudden this idea comes and it's like, what if? What if you did this? What if you started this organization or this project? And of course, behind that is the fear. Maybe nobody will listen. Maybe the funding will not come. Maybe it's a bad idea. And for many of us, it's so easy to let go of these projects. I often say to people, the key is taking that first step and moving forward. And we don't necessarily have to say that the only way we can impact the world, that the only way we can impact our communities is by doing massive projects. No, it's not always about the numbers. Yes, if you can do a project that impacts 50,000 people or 100,000 people or a million or the entire globe, that's good, but that's not all it's about. And in fact, for me personally, sometimes people read my bio and they talk about this and they talk about the large numbers of people that the work that we've been doing has impacted. But I can tell you tonight that my greatest moment where I felt the blessings, where I felt the greatest reward was an experience with only one person. And I'll tell you the story of a young man. His name is James Cowan, a young Liberian man who several years ago, at that time he was in the 9th grade. And he came to our offices to ask for a scholarship because his parents could no longer afford to send him to school. At that point, we had exhausted all of our budget for scholarship. And when I talk scholarship in Liberia, it was just $100. And I said to him, listen, the organization's budget has been exhausted, but I will pay for your tuition to go to school. And every year we paid his tuition. Every year we provided the money to pay his tuition. In 4 years, he graduated at age 16, at the top of his class, scoring the highest mark in all of West Africa's regional tests. He got a scholarship to go to the African Leadership Academy in South Africa that brings together some of the top minds from across Africa. And right now, as I speak to you, he is in the United States on a full scholarship to attend university. It is a tremendous gift. And I often say to people that if I do nothing else in my life, if I did not do another humanitarian project, my heart would be at peace, knowing that a single life has been changed. Because creating a new world, creating a new dynamics, it's not about one person feeling I alone will change the world. It's about individuals. It starts with us. Literally, as Mahatma Gandhi had said, be the change. And that translates to what I want to see in the world. It must happen within me. If I want to see a world free from corruption, I have to be free from corruption. If I want to see a world of peace, I have to have inner peace in my life. Because I believe that world peace is about the change that individuals can make, that my efforts in Liberia can connect to efforts of people in Sierra Leone. Our efforts in Africa connects to efforts of people in Europe and North America. And only then can we create this global quilt of change. It is a world that is very possible. It is a world that if we all can step forward, if we all can put our best foot forward, we can create a new vision for our children and our children's children. I want to leave you with the words of Edmund Burke, that the recipe for evil, the triumph of evil, is when good men, and in this case I add good women, do nothing. This is the challenge to all of you, that we cannot leave and continue to go about with business as usual. There is great pain happening in the world. But there's also a challenge for each and every one of us to take up a mantle and do something to change that. As you leave this room, I challenge you all to say to yourselves, what can I do? How can I inspire and transform my whole own life? And how do I go out and inspire and transform another life? If all of us can come together, if all of us can start to work, believe me, my friends, the possibility of creating a new world order is easier than we think. I want to leave you with the final quote that our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our greatest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. You are all powerful beyond measure. Go out and do great things to transform the world that we live in for the better. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weeks. We now have time for questions, and there are 2 microphones set up in the main aisles. Please line up in front of a microphone if you wish to ask a question, and also remember that the internet in Liberia is a little slow today, so just wait for Dr. Weeks to hear the question. Thanks.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi. Can you see me?
I can see you and hear you.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I am hoping you will find that diamond. When I was growing up in Texas, every day I thought, today will be the day I will strike oil in my backyard. But it never happened. I would just really like to know, how's your mother? She must be so proud of you.
Thank you. My mother is great. Okay, so now it's kind of weird because I can hear myself.
You're
Okay,
fine.
that's better. That's better. Okay, it's better when I can't hear myself because then it's just, yeah. Okay, I'm like, who's that guy? I mean, I thought I was the only person speaking. There's another guy speaking. Um, no, my mother, she has been the greatest inspiration in my life. I love her dearly. She's in Liberia now. You know, I left Liberia under extreme duress. I had done a report in 1997 on the training of child soldiers by the Charles Taylor government at that point. And that report caused the government to really come after me. I was 17 years old, but I had this entire government after me. They shut down my high school. There were men deployed at my office. And even my house, I had to go into hiding. I couldn't go home. My mom was alone in the house, and I was going from friend's house to friend's house every night, running from them. Essentially, after 3 weeks of hiding, where I was in complete lockdown, the U.S. Embassy in Liberia had called me and they said, you know, come in for a meeting. And I walked into this meeting and they said to me, you know, we're going to help you get out because the government is going to get you very soon and they're going to kill you. And so I left, and then so I said, okay, great. Can I go home and pack up? And they said no. I said, well, can my mom come? And they said, no, we don't feel your mom is in danger. And if you leave the embassy now, your safety would no longer be guaranteed. So I left Liberia with only the clothing I was wearing and went out. And the way I left Liberia, they essentially had put me in a car with a bunch of other traditional dancers. The storyline was that we were going to on a tour, on this cultural dance tour. Now, I knew none of the dances, so if someone had stopped the car and said perform, I would have been screwed. But but essentially, we drove from Monrovia to the border of Ivory Coast, and then I crossed into Ivory Coast on the different passport with the name Gregory Coleman. Don't worry, Kimmie Weeks is actually my real name. I got to the U.S. And was away from my mom. Didn't talk to my mom for several years because Liberia did not have cell phone networks at that point. She was very worried that something had happened to me. But when I eventually came back home in 2006, I didn't tell her that I was coming back. So it was a huge surprise. In retrospect, I said, "Wow, I could have given her a heart attack, her seeing me for the first time." But I do love my mom, and she's such a great inspiration. And I think for African mothers and mothers in general around the world who gave so much sacrifices for their children to survive. So thank you very much.
Kimmie, thanks so much for sharing your story. It was really inspiring to hear about your experience. And I appreciate you too sharing the statistics about what it would take to feed and help out with health needs of the world versus what we're spending things on today. I think it brings out a really good point. But from my travels to Nepal and the Middle East and Central America, etc., it seems that there's a common misperception that we can just dump money on a solution and that will help solve the problem. And that's obviously not the case. So I'm wondering if you feel like there are systems in place that could help. If tomorrow I could give you $40 billion to help solve the world's needs in an appropriate way.
Well, first of all, that check would have many, many zeros. You might get tired writing out the zeros. uh, you know, essentially, you strike a great point, and it was one of the reasons why I started Youth Action International. I had obviously, because from my perspective, I've been on both sides of aid. I've been the recipient of aid, and now I'm in the position with this organization to provide aid to people. Um, when the war stopped in Liberia, essentially immediately after the war, as you can imagine, everybody's starving. People need food. They need emergency relief ration. But then after a while, it started to drag on where months, then years, we were still getting these relief rations. And people kept going back to agencies and saying, no, give us seeds. We want to go back to farming. We want, that at that point, microloan was not a buzzword. So, people were like, we want money to start businesses. We want to start our businesses again, etc. But they just kept on giving food, and sometimes the food that were being brought were things that Liberians had never seen or didn't eat. And of course, someone would come and make a statement and say, well, we brought you that particular food because it's got high nutritional value. And well, they had a bad PR on that, because then Liberians started to say, it looks like these guys are trying to kill us all by bringing food we don't want to eat. But essentially, what we do with Youth Action International is all of our projects are tied in with targeting how do we find solutions so people are able to feed themselves. And this is what has to happen in terms of not creating a dependency culture, but creating a culture where people are able to work and they have that dignity from working for themselves. So all of our programs, our women's centers, our vocational training programs where women go in, they learn a particular skill, they're graduating, they get a microloan to start businesses. We've also started small businesses where we're able to do on the job training. So young people come, they're getting trained a skill within our centers, which are businesses running a business model, but they're also getting paid right there. We're doing agriculture programs to help the country feed itself. Liberia's staple is rice. We import 99% of our rice. We eat pepper a lot. Pepper can be grown in Liberia. We're importing 99% pepper, down to eggs. Chicken eggs have to be ordered and imported into Liberia. Just 2 days ago, they told me that there was a shortage of eggs. Just think about that for a moment. A country that has no eggs or that has a shortage of eggs. Basic things that we could do that we're not currently doing, and a big part of our push is how do you boost the agriculture sector and get young people involved. And if you have not read it, I encourage you all to read the book Dead Age. It definitely goes in additional details on this concept and how we could hopefully overhaul the system.
Hi, Dr. Weeks. Thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. I was just wondering, in your comments, you mentioned that we're living in a point of time right now where we have the resources and the know-how to end poverty and global lack of health, education, and social problems. But at the same time, we're still seeing these problems in the everyday life. So I was wondering if you ever identified one main reason why there is this contrast, while we cannot end poverty even though we have the resources and the know-how.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think where we lack it is the willpower. The technology is there because now we're able to grow more food. We're able to reach across boundaries. We're able to connect, like how I'm able to connect with you. The technology is there in terms of cell phone technology, mobile technology, where now people are able to use mobile technology for so many things in terms of improving their lives. The technology is there in terms of using very, very simple technology to purify water. So people don't die from waterborne illnesses. Some of these instruments we can get for very, very little money. The technology is there because we can prevent malaria. Malaria is a disease that kills 2 million people every single year, a bulk of them in Africa. The problem, and it will just take a simple mosquito net. That's a very simple technology. But yet and still 2 million people are dying from malaria. Cholera kills millions of people still. It's a safe drinking water issue, and it takes very, very little to purify water for people. So then the question is, if we have these solutions, why then is extreme poverty still there? I believe it's because the willpower has not been exerted, the willpower that this should happen. Remember, in every country, no matter where it is, whether it's Liberia, whether it's the United States, whether it's the UK, whether it's Spain, governments respond to pressure. We've seen that in the Arab Spring. Governments will respond to pressure. If just imagine today, or let's say just imagine tomorrow, if all of the world's people, or if young people across the world in one voice unified and said that we demand that our governments put all of the resources that we put our best foot towards ending extreme poverty, what do you think would happen? Do you think if every young person in America got up and said, we want Washington to fight to end global poverty, do you seriously think that the US government would not pay attention? The US government would pay attention and the US government would act, but the willpower has to be there. This activism has to come from young people. We make up a bulk of the world's population. In Liberia, the young people under 35 make up over 70% of the population. We have power in numbers, and we have to use that power for the greater good of the world.
I have a question. So, I mean, everything like you're saying is so right, but I would like to know to how many countries have you given this speech besides the United States? Because I was thinking about it and I'm like, okay, the United States is not the only country that can help Africa. I mean, you have the entire Latin America, you have Asia, you have Europe. To how many countries have you given this speech to make a change like we're doing right now in America?
Thank you very much. Sometimes I say I wish I had a mini me who can go to places that I can't go. My desire has always been there because forget about speaking to the developed countries. It's not just about speaking to the developed countries, but even when I'm in Liberia and I travel across Africa, a big part of it is to even speak to African students themselves about what we can do, because it's not just about people coming from the outside and helping us, and that's not how it should be. It should be about young Africans also finding solutions to the problems and being energized. And I always say I'll continue to do these speeches, and I'll go wherever I can go to speak. I've been to many, many countries. I've done it across Europe. I've done several countries in Latin America, many, many countries in Africa. But obviously the message still has to go forward. And this is where you guys become ambassadors. This is where you now have to take up the mantle as you go home, as you talk about this, research it more. It's got to become something that becomes word of mouth. Let's start to tweet about it. Let's try to use Facebook. If people have questions later on, please add me to Facebook. Feel free. If you send me a friend request, I'm not going to think you're a stalker. Unless you actually are a stalker, then I start to get suspicious. But please, we have, and again, this is another example of the resources that we have. Young people being able to connect around the world, being able to inspire entire there was a point where a movement was only something that happened if you could bring people on the streets. You can now have online movements, which are really movements that can make change happen. So we must utilize this technology. We must utilize these blessings. We must utilize it for the best. Let's all become ambassadors. And I'm always going to be talking. As you can see, I like talking. They talk me in a talking machine. You gave me, if the organizers didn't give me a time limit, 3-4 hours later, I'm still talking, and someone might come and say, Kimmie, it's 4 a.m. I'm like, 4 a.m.? Oh, no, nothing. I can go until 7 a.m. So I'm willing to go wherever to talk to whoever.
One more question.
I'm the last one then. Whoa, this is loud. Sorry. Hello, Dr. Weeks. Thank you very much for being here with us today. And hi, you're right there. I was just wondering, has it... It's kind of late, right? So, the question. I was just wondering, has it become a major issue for the world that mere speech of peace as a way to legitimate invasions in other countries, as a way to just exploitate those people as a way to grab resources, natural resources. Because I watched that Coney video. I don't know if you watched it, the Coney 2012. It's very like controversial, I guess, because a lot of people have been saying that it's just a way for the U.S. to get in Uganda and just explore the oil that they have there. So, I mean, it gets really frustrating because you can support that, but then you become kind of skeptical because if you're supporting that, but it's really as a way to exploit those people and not really build peace, then I don't know. I want to know what you think about that. Thank you.
No, I understand your question, and I definitely understand the frustration, and it does become quite frustrating. There are times when interventions happen, and interventions can be good. There's other times when there's the feeling that it was only done for, self-gain. In the case of Sierra Leone is probably a remarkable example in Africa in recent time, where intervention in Sierra Leone, I believe, was done for purely humanitarian purposes. It did work out, and peace returned, and then the troops left. And that was in the case of the UK. The UK basically sent special forces into Sierra Leone to create an opportunity for peace. They did that, and immediately after that happened, they left. Same for Ivory Coast, which is a former French colony next door to Liberia. French troops were sent in during their conflict to help to resolve it and create peace. Obviously, they're still going through that peace process. But again, that was another case where those interventions work. Everything will be a case-to-case basis, and this is why citizens always have to be a watchdog on governments. I often say that if you give governments an inch, they'll take a mile, especially if you're not watching. So if interventions are happening, we also have to make sure we're watching. We have to make sure we're mindful. We have to make sure our voices are being heard, because sometimes it's very, very necessary to have the interventions take place when they take place. Otherwise, you have situations like Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide, where nobody intervened in Rwanda, and 800,000 people died. And you did have the situation where those could be prevented. So I think it's a case by case, but ultimately we as individuals need to be the watchdogs and the custodians of peace in our world.
Again, thank you very much, Dr. Weeks.
Thank you so much.
Bye, thank you. And thank you all. We look forward to seeing you at Emmanuel Jaw's concert. We've had a location change to the Black Box, and PAC board members will be around to lead the way for you. Thank you.